So we are ready for the third and final theme of the morning, land and biodiversity. Welcome back. I hope you're all suitably refreshed after your 10-minute break. Margaret Atwood said, in spring, at the end of the day, you should smell like dirt. Well, given it's autumn and we're on Zoom, we don't really know what Nick smells of right now. What I do know is that Nick Reed cares deeply about all things rural. He is director of the Bright Space Foundation, an Anglican priest, and was honoured in 1999 with an OBE for the alleviation of stress in rural areas. I'd like to give the floor to Nick. Please listen well to him. Nick.
Thank you, Richard. I'm hoping you can all see what I can see. And I'm hoping you can hear me.
We can see that loud and clear.
Excellent. Okay. So my brief this morning is to sort of set the scene for what the Land Use and Biodiversity Group are going to be doing this afternoon. So I'm introducing the topic in a very broad brush sense. The detail will come out with the speakers that you're going to listen to later. But it's also to excite you in the hope that you might join room 3, as we call it, which is the Biodiversity and Land Use breakout room. So my first slide is just to set the scene. All human activity produces greenhouse gases. So this is not a dig at the agricultural industry. It's simply that we have to be aware of what we're contributing to the overall carbon load. So the pie chart on the left is international, and the pie chart on the right is the equivalent for the UK. And what makes agriculture interesting and different from the other industrial sectors that we're looking at is the content of those greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is a very small component, and nitrous oxides and methane is much more important, and they behave differently from CO2. So we're not looking at the same things as the other sectors are. The second thing which is important to be aware of in terms of agriculture is that we're dealing with biological diversity. Each field can be different in terms of its productive potential, whether it faces the sun or not. There's huge variability both in biology itself and in the weather and so on that agriculture experiences. So one size simply does not fit all, and we have to have a nuanced approach to this problem. And of course, land use has multiple objectives, and we mustn't forget that. And the primary objective is that it makes a living for people. And if we ignore that, we do so at our peril. But there are multiple objectives. So it's to do with the impact on the water cycle, on biodiversity, on food production, on landscape, recreation, etc., etc. And it's very easy to look at a problem through a single lens. But when you're dealing with land use, you need to have multiple lenses. And weighing the balance between multiple objectives is quite important. And the third thing about agriculture is that essentially it produces commodities that the rest of us value and use. What we do with those commodities sets the market, governs the economics, but also contributes to the carbon balance. And that is especially true of food. So you cannot have a debate about land production and greenhouse gases without including food and what we do with food as part of the problem. And as you'll see from the pie charts, it's particularly true of ruminant animals. They have this wonderful capacity of eating grass and turning it into edible products and drinkable products. But in doing so, at both ends of their alimentary canals, they produce some pretty potent greenhouse gases. So that's part of the mix. I am now having difficulty changing slides. There we go. Well, if my first slide was agriculture as part of the problem, my second slide is emphatically agriculture as part of the solution. Again, we'll revisit this in more detail this afternoon, but the United Kingdom Committee on Climate Change has produced an assessment, policies for net zero agriculture. And this is just the potential. So this isn't being realized at the moment, but it's what you can do with farming and food use in order to significantly reduce the greenhouse gases that are produced. I'm going to allow you to read that for yourselves. There's a whole range of techniques and practices in there, from looking at things like intensive agriculture with controlled release fertilizers, low hanging fruit, increasing woodland cover. The national target is to increase cover from 13% to 17% by 2050. We have rather low woodland cover in the United Kingdom compared to other parts of the world. In the Marches Nature Partnership has adopted a target of doubling woodland cover by 2030. That can significantly soak up large amounts of carbon. Agroforestry, so the integration of trees and agricultural production, has an impact. Restoration of peatlands, Phil Holden this afternoon is going to comment on that in relation to this area. Perhaps more controversial, but growing bioenergy crops, so replacing fossil fuels with renewables, and then we get back also to food. And it's quite a modest target that's been set by CCC, a 20% reduction in the amount of food that we eat. That's carbon food, so again, we're back to our ruminants, and a 20% reduction in food waste. I live in Herefordshire, and someone in Herefordshire Council has the fascinating job of going through our black bins. And what they find, and they've just published the report, is 40% of what was in the bins was treatable food waste. And of that, more than half, 57%, was still in its original packaging. So we buy lots of food that we don't actually use, and then we throw it away. Reducing food waste is something that we can all do. If my last slide was agriculture as part of the solution, this is agriculture as critical to the solution. And it's the bar chart on the top, which is interesting. So this is the total amount of carbon emitted from the UK per year. And it's broken down into energy, non-energy, and land use. But the bit I want you to focus on is the dark green blob to the very left of your screen. That's the potential to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And that potential is realized when we manage soil appropriately. About 80% of carbon in terrestrial ecosystems is located in the soil. It's about 72% even in a forest. And the potential for soil carbon is that it holds 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere does. It's really second only to the ocean and the fossil fuels that are still in the ground as a carbon sink. And you probably know that the Paris Agreement set the target of 4 per 1,000. That is 4 parts per 1,000, or 0.4% increase in soil organic matter every year. If we can achieve that globally, we would lock up the same amount of carbon every year that Europe actually produces. Now that isn't likely to happen, but the potential is vast. And I have to say it's much more significant, for example, than woodland cover. If you doubled the area of woodland cover in the UK and allow those trees to grow to maturity, as a back of the envelope calculation, you would lock up approximately the same amount of carbon that we produce every year. But it would take you however long it took for those trees to grow to maturity to do it. It's important, but if we get soil science right, then we begin to impact, because we're not going to reach net zero unless we do that. Other sectors will always produce some carbon. There's lots of things we can do, as my colleagues are pointing out, in order to reduce carbon outputs. But you won't get to net zero across all industrial sectors. What soil management, what farming allows you to do is to soak up that additional carbon in the soil so that overall we are on net zero. And that's the crucial significance of the land-based sector to what the rest of us are trying to do. None of this takes place in a policy vacuum, and within the UK, broadly speaking, there are 3 bits to land use policy. An agriculture and an environment bill, both of which were introduced late last year, both of which got held up because of Brexit and the general election, and which have now been reintroduced into Parliament in January this year. The agriculture bill is currently in the House of Lords at the report stage, and the environment bill in the House of Commons at the committee stage. These are 2 of the 3 planks to policy which impacts on what we're talking about in land use and biodiversity. The agriculture bill is introducing us to the idea of environmental land management schemes, or ELMs. This is where a lot of public funding is going to be directed in the future. There are currently, or there will be, 69 test and trial schemes. There will be a national pilot launched sometime next year, and the plan is for the whole scheme to be up and running by late 2024. Generally speaking, the feeling is that the market sets the price for basic commodities, the food that we eat, but that public funding should go in to things which are being called public goods. So the things that land managers do which benefit all of us, such as clean water, such as biodiversity, such as carbon sequestration. We don't know the detail. We don't know what the funding will be, but it's going to be hugely important to the sorts of things we want to do locally that we get that right. The other jargon that's been introduced in recent years is this idea of natural capital. In the same way that you can have a pot of money, some capital, and you can use it to invest and buy things, so nature provides us with natural capital, and the services that we get, such as clean water, such as fertile soils, we call ecosystem services. To some extent, it allows you to monetize these things and put them into a value system that the rest of us generally work with. The value, I'm not saying I approve of it, but the economic value. The last natural capital assessment for the Marches concluded that the value of what we've got in terms of nature is as important as the total industrial output from the area, which at the time was a roughly 17 billion. So that language is beginning to permeate into agricultural policy. Second strand is an environment bill, again introduced earlier this year, currently in the House of Commons. That's introducing the idea of nature recovery networks. The principle being that we don't just need to keep what we've already got, we need to allow nature to recover and actually put something back in terms of biodiversity. And the first iteration of that was a 25-year environment plan that was published 2 years ago. So that strand is going to work its way through, and as I say, Phil Holden is going to expand on that bit this afternoon. But the third strand brings us back to food. There is going to be a national food strategy. The first iteration has been published. It's been heavily influenced by the effects of COVID, but part 2, which is expected next year, will include climate change, biodiversity. So it's trying to tie everything together and ensure that we have a holistic approach to land use, biodiversity and food. The column on the right is simply that in addition to all of those government initiatives and policy-led initiatives, there is a wealth of material being published, some of which is quite stark. The UN Strategic Plan for Biodiversity was launched 10 years ago from Nagoya in Japan. It set 20 targets known as the High-Chi targets. Every member that signed, and there were 190 governments that signed up to this, was meant to produce a report on how well they had implemented the targets. The UK report produced by the Joint National Committee, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, JNCC, reckons that we failed on 14 out of the 20. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds published its own assessment that reckons that we failed on 17 out of the 20. And internationally, the UN published its own report, and that says basically that we failed on all 20. So we set targets 10 years ago and none of them have actually been met. And that's, of course, part of the problem. It's easy to write about these things. What we've got to do is translate it into actual practice. But there are signs of hope. The NFU has now declared its public intention that British agriculture will be net zero by 2040. The UK government has also revised its target. It was, as you remember, going to be 80% down on 1990 levels by 2050. It's now aiming to be net zero by 2050. Well, it's easy to say these things, but policies are important, and policies lead, hopefully, to increased resources. And we're going to need to utilise those if we're going to hit the target that we're setting ourselves in South Shropshire. So very briefly to end, what are we talking about? It's almost impossible to get figures just for a constituency. So these are Shropshire-wide figures. Farmland by type is the pie chart on the left. And as you already know, grassland is hugely important to us. It's about 60% of the land area, which is above the national average. So again, we're back into looking at those ruminants. But Shropshire is also important for the livestock, other livestock as well. So you're the third largest producer of poultry in England, second only to Herefordshire and Breckland. And if, like me, you don't know where Breckland is, it's part of Norfolk. It's Bernard Matthews country, basically. You're the second largest producer of sheep in England, second only to Northumberland, and you're the third largest producer of cattle. Sorry, yeah. So ruminant animals, hugely important and part of the equation. Farm sizes in Shropshire, we're talking about roughly 3,700 businesses, 20% of all registered businesses within the county. Again, no surprise, there's been a massive reduction in the overall numbers of farms, particularly from 2005. That's due to a variety of factors. But what's happening now, and it mirrors a national trend, is that the number of small farms is increasing. Now, it can be pejorative to call them part-time farms, but it's farms where people aren't necessarily earning their living from food production or its lifestyle choices. It's a family-sized farm which is being squeezed, and that's been a trend over the last 2 decades. But when you look at the total area farmed, and that's the pie chart on the right, the relatively small number of farms of more than 100 hectares account for 2/3 of the total land area. So the one thing we've got to do is be able to appeal to mainstream farming. It's often quite easy to get into a dialogue with someone who's bought a bit of land in the countryside and who's already interested in some of the issues we're talking about. But if we don't crack mainstream agriculture, we are not going to hit the target. There's a range of things that we can do. This is by no means exhaustive, and they range from cover crops, so that's making sure that the land is always covered, leaky dams, looking at ways of controlling floods through natural processes. People are interested in biochar, so that's a form of charcoal which is carbon rich, which can be added to the soil. There's agroforestry, integrating trees and farming. There's a lot of interest in what is called rewilding. It's perhaps unfortunate. It can mean introducing apex predators back into the wild, but I don't think we are talking about that for South Shropshire. The picture of the longhorn cattle is from the Knepp estate in Sussex. That estate has completely gone back to natural processes. But you have to be real. They earn far more of their income through agro-tourism than they do from food production. And then there are techniques which are variously called zero-till, no-till, or min-till farming. Ways of growing food without ploughing. But again, there's a trade-off, because often you need to use quite powerful herbicides for weed control. So a range of things that we could look at, and we want to explore the possibilities for this part of the world. What is doable and what will have the most impact? And so that's where we come to this afternoon. We have 4 speakers for you, dealing with biodiversity, dealing with local food systems, so looking at the food angle as well, and then 2 local farmers who are going to tell you what they're doing. And we thought it was important to choose all of our speakers from this locality. We're not looking at a blank sheet of paper. There are people already doing things, and we want to build on the passion and the activity that's already there. The end.
Nick, fabulous. Thank you very, very much for that canter through all things rural and biodiversity. So we have some really good questions lined up. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am, but somebody called Daisy has a question about wildflowers. Daisy, would you like to ask your question?
Good morning. My question is, how can we maintain or recover our wild meadows, or what incentives could we provide farmers to help maintain them or recover them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do most of my work in Herefordshire. I actually live in Herefordshire, although I used to live just outside Bishop's Castle. Herefordshire has a meadows group. So where people who are interested in the question, land managers and farmers, actually get together and begin to swap ideas. And I think it would be, and in Shropshire itself, in your part of the world, you have Land, Life and Livelihood. There's the work that Phil Holden is doing through the AONB partnership and so on. So I think it is possible to get people together to begin to look at some landscape scale approaches. There are incentives and public goods. The ELM system, I think one of the trial projects is looking at meadows, but it needs to be done over a sufficiently large scale that you build critical mass. So I'm optimistic that species-rich meadows can be brought back into mainstream farming.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Nick. Julian Dean, next question, please.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So no, it's just I saw. I was reading an article recently about this idea of rock dust as a way of improving soil and the carbon sink. I was wondering if that's a realistic option or structure.
Sorry, I lost a lot of that. The quality
Nick,
wasn't.
a question was about using rock dust, adding rock dust to soil
Yes.
to improve its carbon containing nature.
It has been talked about. Someone recently visited Herefordshire to give a lecture on the subject. I'm not aware of it being adopted generally yet, but yeah, there are technological fixes that we can look at. I guess though that we've again, A, what's practicable, and B, that we're not just creating another problem further down the line. But certainly the research is being done, yeah, and it's one of the techniques that has been talked about and is being written up.
Great, thank you. And there's also been some follow-up in the chat about that particular question as well, right, from Julian. So yeah, Maggie Taylor-Sanders, third question, please.
Hello, Nick. Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable. You expressed some qualms about the language that's used for these things. I have a great deal of concern about the language we use to describe our relationship with nature. And it makes a big difference in our heads if we have better words than services or stewardship or and such words. Like George Monbiot, for example, said we shouldn't call it climate change anymore. Change is just too benign. You know, it should be called climate breakdown or something, to be more honest. But words like stewardship and services that's provided to us puts us too much at the center of the relationship. It makes it into a subject-object relationship, which I think is part of our big problem. Is there any way that we can use better language that will indicate?
Yeah, I entirely agree with you, both as an Anglican priest and a practitioner. The reason the language was used was to try and enable those who normally deal with, say, an understanding of economics to see the point. I put it as bluntly as that. So the feeling was we need to present things in ways that they are comfortable with, rather perhaps than the language that we might be comfortable with. I agree with you. I think we need to be extraordinarily careful how we use it and what that does to our own perceptions of where we fit in to life in general. But I think the value is that it has actually initiated a debate with people who weren't involved in the debate previously. So I'm sort of content to use it through gritted teeth, if I can put it that way. But I do not want to be governed by it. And I think nature is important simply because it exists, you know, and I'm privileged to be a part of it, you know, so.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. David H, I don't know your surname, David, but could you
David Howard.
Next question, please, David.
Right, hope you can hear me. What incentives, both local and national, might help encourage agriculturalists to change their practices?
One of the incentives, I think, has got to be understanding how the market works. I mean, I've touched on the importance of food and the importance of the consumer. I am not advocating that everyone becomes vegan, but I certainly know, for example, that I eat more meat than is good for me and that is good for the planet. So there are things we can all do, because at the end of the day, we set the market. The second incentive is that we actually pay a realistic value for the food that farmers produce. And we don't. And that, I suppose that is a criticism to some extent of the Common Agricultural Policy, but UK governments before we joined Europe was also subsidising agriculture. And I think it broadly is a welcome shift to begin to look at how public money is going into things that benefit the public and the planet generally. but there's an important question also of food security. So there'll be a financial incentive in terms of how the market works, in terms of how these new ELMS schemes and nature recovery networks are going to be funded. And then I think the other incentive is actually working with local farmers to maximise the opportunities. Farmers have had a very bad press generally, and a lot of it is not deserved. I mean, we can always point to all industrial sectors and say you're causing a problem. But I think the ability to see farmers as part of the solution and to work with them to realise that and build that feel-good factor locally is also part of the solution. Is something we can all do. And I'm not saying that we should not face up to some of the realities of what's happening with intensive livestock production and everything like that. But I'd far rather work with people than just stand back and shout at people. So I think there's a role that we can all play in setting the conditions for success.
Great. Thank you, Nick. We have somebody, Joe Shrewsbury. Joe from Shrewsbury. Could you ask your question to Nick, please? Are you there, Joe? Joe doesn't seem to be on the line. So I will read Joe's question. What contribution do you think continuous grain cropping could make to reducing emissions and increasing biodiversity?
So that's the argument, I suppose, about whether you take land out of ruminant production and you put it down to arable. There are a number of nuanced answers to that. The first is how you do the continuous grain cropping. The second is that it would not make any sense at all to plough up large areas of permanent pasture in particular. You would release vast amounts of carbon if you did that. And the third is going back to the question of the multifaceted outputs of agriculture. Animals are important for recycling, for adding nutrients, for building up soil carbon storage as well. So
could I just pause a second? I think Joe just wants to come in.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, sorry, I had a technical problem. It's actually, that's not what continuous grain cropping is. It's quite a new thing, so probably a lot of people wouldn't be familiar with it. It's the work of an archaeobotanist called John Letts, who's looked at heritage varieties of wheat and how cereals used to be grown as genetically diverse populations. So it's not about converting livestock land to cereals. It's about using existing cereal land more efficiently, and it actually avoids the need for rotation. So most organic cereal production has a 5-year rotation or whatever, with the lees built in and fallow periods built in, whereas continuous grain cropping, which is just being researched now, allows cereals to be produced year on year in the same field without rotation by having a genetically diverse mix, including some permitted weeds. But anyway, we can
so clearly I didn't know what it was, and I'd be delighted to let's put it into the debate, certainly.
Yeah, great, Joe. Fabulous. We have just room for 2 more questions. I'd like to call on somebody called Philip Dunn, who I imagine some of you may know. Philip, do you have a question, sir?
Yes, thank you, Nick, very much. And can I just, or thank you, Richard. Can I just start by thanking everybody for organising this? I think it's a tremendous initiative, very supportive. And I get a slot to say a few words a bit later on. Just for Nick, I think your presentation has been outstanding, very well balanced and measured, reflecting the economic realities of the requirement to produce food. Just one observation, which I put up on the chat. Severn Trent Water, in response to the question about how do we incentivize changes in behavior, have this autumn launched a nature plan under which they're providing funding to farmers to plant cover crops over the winter, for example. There's a whole host of measures, but the one that I'm familiar with, because our farmers just taken advantage of it, we planted 20 hectares of cover crop on cereal ground that would otherwise be left in stubble over winter. And this will reduce runoff, provide vegetation which will be ploughed, will enrich the soil when it's re-sown in the autumn, because it won't be harvested. And they're paying us to do so. So that has definitely encouraged us to change behaviour, and with many other farmers in the Severn Trent region in Shropshire. My question is over your view about the realism of the objective to try to double tree cover in the marches. You showed us the land holding graph and made the very good point that we've got to encourage all land users to participate. If we're going to double tree cover, that would be taking far more land out of food production than is required to meet the national objective.
It need not. I think what we need is some decent spatial mapping. Identify those areas where, in fact, probably as agricultural production is marginal anyway, and we face up to that. The second is that how we integrate trees with farming. So we don't do a great deal of what they call agroforestry in this country. It's far more common on the continent, and it's certainly more common in sort of hotter tropical areas. But there's huge potential to do that. So I don't think it necessarily means that we're looking at vast areas of land suddenly being covered by trees. It's about being canny about how we utilize our hedgerows and interplant within the hedgerows, about utilizing the areas of farms that actually aren't necessarily that productive, but with a careful watch on biodiversity, so that we don't just trash species-rich grassland by planting them with trees, and with managing the trees we've got better and allowing them to sequester carbon rather than just wither and die within the hedgerows and so on. So it's not just about turning land into forest.
Thank you, Nick. The final question of this morning's slot goes to Mr. Peter Norman. Peter, your question, please. Are you out there?
Unmute. Can you hear me now? Sorry. Yes, Nick, what are the most important measures to take to reverse the drastic decline in the insect population, particularly the decline in pollinators?
Making sure that the habitats for those pollinators are restored. I mean, essentially, we feed our insects quite a monotonous diet these days. We don't give them many options about where they're going to overwinter, and so it is about understanding the ecology of the insect and trying to ensure. I mean, that's sort of what a nature recovery network is about, is looking at things on a sufficiently large scale to actually give you some of these multiple benefits. Does that make sense? I mean, you can pick on a particular species and say it needs that, but we're looking at a whole range of species that actually need a helping hand.
Well, the comment is useful, but does it reflect the magnitude of the decline that we've been talking about, which must require fairly drastic action to reverse?
Well, internationally, it certainly does, yeah. I mentioned the high G targets. This is at the end of the decade of biodiversity. No country has managed to implement all of the targets that government signed up to 10 years ago. And the latest Living Planet report suggests that internationally 68% of our species are suffering serious declines. And in Europe, it's about 24%. And that's where the idea of extinction, Extinction Rebellion and all that came from, this sort of this serious analysis of what we're doing to the world. So yeah, the task is huge, but I think there are certainly things we can do. I mean, that's part of this afternoon's session as well, that Phil's going to look at, but there are certainly things we can do. The issue is it's got to be done on a large enough scale to actually have the impact. And individual farmers doing things is very important, but collectively a lot needs to happen as well. So it's much more joined up than it has been.
Okay. Nick, we need to draw a line under your session at that particular point. I know many people have signed up to this afternoon session. So on behalf of all 120 people that have witnessed what you've just done, maybe we'll say a heartfelt thank you to you. Thank you very much. Brilliant.
My pleasure.